Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, so this morning's reading is from Ephesians 6, verses 1 to 9. That's on page 884 in the Bibles in front of you. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, please would you open our eyes that we might behold wonderful things in your word, and by your Holy Spirit melt our hearts and mould our wills, that we might live in humble obedience to all that we read. In Jesus' precious name, amen. Great, do come with me to Ephesians 6 and those first 9 verses. I remember once reading an article in a local Herefordshire paper all about Percy and Florence Arrowsmith. He was 105, she was 100. They'd been married for 80 years. Percy was asked the secret of a long marriage. Percy replied with just 2 words, "Yes, dear." But what was striking was the response of the reporter, who went on to write this in the article. Let's face it, putting ourselves second went out along with the names Percy and Florence. It's an alien idea. Today we want our own way. We live in an age of the individual. The individual demands to be respected, to be heard, to have any consumer goods they fancy, to be financially independent, and above all, to always be right. We have evolved into a nasty, short-tempered, ill-mannered, and greedy society. Wow. I was blown away by reading those words by a local reporter. Profound and so true. And in Ephesians 5:21, which I think you probably would have done last week, or was it the week before, through to 6:9 that we're looking at now, what we discover is the way of Jesus is countercultural. His call to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ goes against the grain of the way most of our world thinks. And this is not submit in the way I remember submission when I used to sit with my gran and granddad. Most of you won't be old enough, but some of you will, watching Saturday afternoon wrestling with Giant Haystacks and all the others. 2 falls, 2 submissions, or a knockout. Submission was where you pinned them to the ground until they gave up. That is not the submission that Paul is talking about. He's saying that wherever you are, whoever you are, whatever role you have, your primary call is to serve others. That is your primary call, whoever you are, whatever role you have in life. And as the reporter tells us, that is radical and countercultural. And it's so radical and so countercultural that even as Christians, we might find the teachings of Ephesians quite uncomfortable, because it feels so alien to the world in which we live. Well, I think it's meant to be uncomfortable because it was in Paul's day, just as it is in ours day. Last week you looked at marriage. This week we've got family life, and what I hope we'll see is work life. I'm going to be honest, it is too much to do in one sermon. I'm going to spend more on the second than I am on the first, partly because I think the first Read what it says, it's obvious what it's saying. Our problem there is not understanding it, our problem there is doing it. But part of the reason is also we've just sent our kids out. So it feels a bit unfair that we go to talk about parents and children, and yet we've just sent them out. So dads, listen up. I've got one or two things to say to you very quickly before we move on to the next session. The first is this is serious. The key part of your role as dads is to submit yourselves to your kids, to serve your kids. How? First, don't exasperate them, says Paul. What Paul is saying is this: dads, what most frustrates your kids about you? I don't just mean that you don't give them everything they want every moment. Of course, we understand that. No, but deep down, what is it that really frustrates them? Because I know exactly what it was with my kids. I only gave them half my attention. 22, 25 now, and I have them coming. I still deeply regret it. Deeply regret it. I didn't listen properly. I was distracted by work. I didn't give them quality time. I remember Tom coming to ask me to play football all the time, because of course when you work from home, they get back from school, come on Dad, come and play. I'd go out, and he knew from the moment I stepped out, I was just waiting to get back in the study. He could tell it. He could tell I wasn't totally committed to what he was wanting me to do with him. When I'd read with him at bed in the evening, he could tell I wasn't really fully focused. And I had that horrible moment when one day he literally got hold of my face, pulled my face in front and said, "Daddy, listen to me with your eyes." Because he knew, he could tell from my eyes I was distracted. I was somewhere else. And now, age 22, I still feel the pain of that. He's with us at the moment. In fact, he's going today. I still look back and go, why didn't I just focus more? Because if you asked him now, what is it about Dad? You know, he'll say lots of lovely things. He'll say he doesn't listen. What frustrates your kids about you? And what are you doing about it before it's too late? I don't want to lay on guilt, but I look back and think, oh, if only. And I think Paul is saying, don't get to those if-only moments. Spot what it is now. Make time. And of course, that time then links with the other thing he says, which is that it's our responsibility to bring our kids up in the training and instruction of the Lord. We have just sent our kids out, which is great and right. But if I'm honest, there were times when probably I abdicated my responsibility to children's group leaders on a Sunday. And then one year I did the maths. Maybe our children's group leaders get about half an hour of quality time to look at the Bible with our kids in their groups. Half an hour. How many weeks a year does that happen? Even if it was 50 weeks a year, or let's call it 48 weeks a year taking out the holidays, that's 24 hours in 1 year. That is the maximum time that our children's leaders have with our children, 24 hours in 1 year. That is not very much, is it? And it just reminds us that the spiritual health of our children sits at home, not abdicated to children's leaders or to schools. If you're in a church school, I know from being a governor in a church school that most of the teachers in the church school didn't understand the Christian faith at all. They understood Christian values, but they didn't understand the gospel. And it just reminds us that we have precious moments with our children. Now, this all sounds like I'm laying guilt. I do remind you from my own story that God is in control of the lives of our children. Becca walked away age 15. At age 22, she came back. It was nothing to do with us. It was all to do with God. So please don't hear me laying guilt on you. But Paul is saying, take our responsibility. Dads, seriously. Parents, seriously. But that's all I'm going to say on that, because I want to take some time to look at the next part, because in some ways it's perhaps a bit harder to get our heads around, because the concept we're talking about here, slaves and masters, servants and masters, feels a billion miles away from our world today. It's perhaps worth saying that in Paul's day, virtually every house in the Roman Empire was touched in some way by slavery. Slaves were part of the household. There were over 60 million slaves in the Roman Empire. In the big cities like Ephesus, Rome, Corinth, about a third of the population were slaves. It was the dominant institution in the Roman Empire. And in the Ephesian church, some were masters. In Colossae, Philemon, a book that's named after him, you'll know in the New Testament, was a master. Others would have been slaves. Others would have been slaves who had been freed. Others didn't have slaves because they were too poor. Everyone at Ephesus in this church would have been touched in some way by slavery, servanthood. It was a live issue. But what's the relevance to 21st century Bath? First, it's perhaps important just to catch ourselves, because we will find in most of our minds the issue of slavery is abhorrent. And in fact, we've been through as a country, haven't we? And quite a lot of churches are going through this because they're discovering within their churches how many of those memorials are to slave owners. So when Fran was at Walcott Church, there are many of the things there which are to slave owners. Bath Abbey has had to do an awful lot of work on that. Simeon trustees, who I'm with, who are a patronage board, had Hyman's trust as well, discovered that Hyman's money had come from slavery. And we had to give churches a chance to withdraw from this Hyman's trust and transfer to Simeon's because of that link to slavery. It's worth just understanding what it meant perhaps more, though, in New Testament times before we bring our own understanding or thoughts of slavery. It's not the case that in the New Testament times that slavery was necessarily oppressive or abhorrent in the same way. Yes, back in Aristotle's time, slaves were tools. They were inanimate things. In Roman law, slave was a non-person before the law, and some suffered terribly. You could be executed just for badly handling a dove. But in New Testament times, there were sweeping reforms. Not actually as a result of Christianity at this time, but they were Roman reforms. And by the New Testament times, most slaves were freed by the age of 30, women by the age of 15. Slaves could own property, slaves could own other slaves, slaves could control their own finances and invest it. You could have high-class slaves and lower-class slaves, depending on who you work for. They could live separately to their masters. They could own their own house. By New Testament times, by and large, slavery was not so much like African slavery as we imagine it now. Perhaps a bit more Downton Abbey, if I can put it that way, upstairs and downstairs. So you just need to be slightly careful of falling into the danger of seeing the New Testament as somehow supporting oppression and slavery in that way that we do feel very uncomfortable about. It would have been very hard for Christianity at that stage to challenge culture because society would have collapsed economically if slavery had been abolished then and there. But eventually change did come, and Christianity, as we know, was often at the heart of changing the whole situation for slaves, especially in the later centuries. But I do think it's probably possible and probably right that we see New Testament master-slave, master-servant relationships as much more akin to employment relationships today. Boss, employee. We've got to be careful that we don't kind of just immediately say it's exactly the same, but I think it probably is pretty close to where we are. The same kind of rights probably exist. And sometimes as employees, you probably feel like a slave, don't you? Grinding it out. I also want to suggest that maybe the principles here, we might take a bit of license and apply them into all sorts of relationships where there is power, where there's a boss and someone who's working, even into a voluntary place. Maybe you don't work in a workplace anymore. Maybe you are someone who offers lots of your time voluntarily. Citizens Advice, Charity Shop, League of Friends, WI. Maybe you're a leader in the church and others are volunteers in the church. Possibly even students, lecturers, dare I say, you might want to see it in these terms. See what you think, but here are 4 principles I think that Paul picks out for those of you who are members or volunteers or employees, students. Here are 4 things that it says to those of us how we are to treat those in authority over us. Number 1, work for them respectfully, verse 5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear. When it says fear, it doesn't mean a kind of servile fear, quaking in your boots, yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full sir. It has that sense of reverence and respect for the position that the boss, the leader, holds. See, most of the Christian slaves would have had non-Christian bosses. They would have spent a lot of time with them. Maybe their boss was someone of great high standing in society, in the town, in the city. The slave would have seen them all day, every day. They knew what they were really like. They'd seen them at their best and at their worst. They'd seen their weaknesses. As they say, familiarity breeds contempt. Easy to be disrespectful and sarcastic when you know what someone's really like. To take a sort of undermining attitude, to look down on the boss. And his employees to start to slag the boss off. To talk them down in public. To tell them what you know, who you saw them with. Just to undermine their standing. It's interesting, in 1 Timothy 6:1, Paul says this, all who are under the yoke of slavery should consider their masters worthy of full respect. Why? Paul goes on, so God's name and our teaching may not be slandered. Disrespectfulness, a bad attitude of an employee to an employer, a team member to a team leader, dishonours God and dishonours the gospel, is what Paul says. Please note, this is not because the boss deserves it. It's not because they're a good boss, but because of the position they hold. We are to show real respect. Now, I want to just say something. That is not, though, an excuse for bullying in the workplace and for not saying something if you're being treated in a way that is absolutely not right in the workplace. That is not what we're saying here. We're saying, though, in the normal way of being, let's not seek to undermine our bosses, slagging them off, gossiping about them. We're to show them respect. Secondly, work for them sincerely. Verse 5b, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. With sincerity of heart, a singleness, it says, or a singleness of heart, an undivided heart, an undivided mind. In other words, serve them fully. Why? Just as you would obey Christ. And this theme comes up, verse 5, verse 6, verse 7. Obey them not only to win their favour, but like slaves of Christ. Serve wholeheartedly, verse 7, as if you were serving the Lord. Our work as employee or as volunteer, wherever we are, I need to regard myself in the role as serving Christ. Not just serving a human boss, but I'm a slave of Christ, a slave of him as my master. So if I'm at home, I need to parent for Christ, clean the house for Christ, cook for Christ. If I'm a teacher, I teach children as if doing it for Christ. If I'm a nurse, treat my patients as if I'm doing this for Christ. If I'm a lawyer, advise my clients as if I'm doing it for Christ. If I'm an accountant, audit the books as if I'm doing it for Christ. If I'm pushing the tuck trolley in the hospital, do it for Christ. If I'm writing that essay that I just hate doing, do it for Christ, is what Paul is saying here. Do you see? The attitude is key. 3 people building a cathedral. Each asks, why are you doing what you're doing? One says, I'm chipping away at some stone. The second says, I'm earning a living. The third says, I'm building a cathedral to the glory of God. Same job, but each has a slightly different attitude. Maybe it doesn't feel like you're building a cathedral to the glory of God. But actually, each and every one of us, with whatever we do day by day, we can do it to his glory, as if we're doing it for him. And that's what Paul is saying here. In whatever you're doing, do it for Christ. Thirdly, work for them conscientiously, verse 6. Obey them not only to win their favour when their eye is on you, but like slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your hearts. When I was at school, we had PE lessons, and I had a really strict PE. I can remember him now. He was horrible. PE teacher. And he would make us do press-ups. Yet sometimes he'd walk away, so you'd be doing your press-ups, and then the minute he walked away, suddenly you'd stop moving your arms. You just sort of nod your head up and down and wiggle your bum up and down, you know. And then as soon as you turn around, oh, we're back at it now. You know what it's like. When you're being watched, you do it. When you're not being watched, but it's very easy, isn't it, at work to do the same. When the boss is around, I'm all action. When he walks away, I'm all Facebook. Whereas Paul is saying, whatever you do, you need to do it with enthusiasm and do it with energy. It's behind the parable of the talents, isn't it? In Matthew 25, 3 servants are given 5, 2, and 1 talent. The master goes away, and while they're away, 2 of them work hard. The 5 and the 2 talents are doubled. Well done, good and faithful servants, they're told. But the one who with 1 does nothing, he buries it, and he's condemned as lazy. You cannot be a lazy, faithful servant. Hardworking and conscientious. Yes, perhaps your job is boring or soulless. There are times I hate my job, can I be honest? But no matter, I need to do it for Christ. There's a story of a pastor who founded 2 big theological colleges in the US. Before World War II, he was invited to preach in Poland. While he was there, he was invited to go to a massive estate of a prince. And while there, the prince stopped and pointed to one of the workers and said, "You see that young man? He's the best worker on my estate. It was due to him that I invited you here today. A religion that could change a man's ethics like that and make him so remarkable must be something to know." How we do our job may well make an impact on those around us. Finally, work for them pleasantly. When it says work wholeheartedly, serve wholeheartedly, verse 7, actually, the word there, if you went to the RSV, is work with goodwill. Enthusiasm. In your workplace, are you a pleasure to work with? Are you a pleasant team member? Are you a joy to have around? What will people think of you at work if I went and asked them in your team? Well, by and large, are you known to be negative, griping, sour? A Christian is meant to be pleasant. Why? Because there will be a reward. Do you see that? Because you know that the Lord will reward everyone for whatever good he does, whether he is slave or free. God cares how we do our job, not just that we do it, but the manner, the way in which we are with the people around us. Why? Because how we work for Christ in our workplace or where we volunteer, how we treat other people, respectfully, single-mindedly as if for Christ, conscientiously and pleasantly, it's likely to have an impact for the gospel. It'll either turn people off or it may turn people on. But hang on, you say, this is all about employees. What about the bosses? Do you notice there's only a very small 1 verse about bosses? Masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. 2 things if you're a boss. Firstly, do as you would be done by. Masters, treat slaves in the same way. If you want respect off of those that work for you, then treat your employees with respect. If you want them to work hard and conscientiously for them, well then work hard for them as well. If you want them to be conscientious, then you need to be committed to them. If you want them to be committed to you, commit yourselves to them, to their welfare, to their well-being. If you want them to be pleasant employees, then be a pleasant employer. Be one that people love to say good things about. Be interested in the welfare of those that you have under your care. Because if you do, productivity, harmony, and creativity will blossom. And bosses, remember who you are. You are to be like Christ to those whom you lead. Because he's your master. And therefore there is no business in bullying or being harsh or throwing people around just because you can, of treating people as second-class citizens just because you've got the power. Be Christ-like bosses. And who knows, if you did that, if we did that, what might that mean for Christ in the places where we work day by day? Why not have a go? Why not try it out? See what happens. Amen.